Hi, I'm Michelle Kaffenberger, and I'm a research fellow with the RISE program at the University of Oxford. RISE stands for Research for Improving Systems of Education, and it is a large-scale research program dedicated to understanding how to improve system coherence for learning. In this first lecture of Unit 2, I'll talk a bit about the goals that nations and education systems have set for themselves and committed to, and then I'm going to spend most of the time giving an overview of the learning crisis. This is going to lay the groundwork and help set the context for subsequent lectures, both in this unit and also for some of the lectures later on in this course as well. So in these lectures, I am going to give evidence of the breadth and depth of the learning crisis. Then second, I'll introduce the concept of a learning trajectory as an analytic and diagnostic tool for education systems analysis. And then finally, I'll present findings of learning trajectory analyses that show how they can be applied to inform education system policy priorities. So what I want to do first is paint a picture of the global learning crisis and why it's so critical that we take seriously the need to address it. And then in the next two lectures, I'll provide tools for analyzing how to best address it. So the world has long been committed to the goal of a quality education for every child. Dating back to 1948, with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, education was included as one of the agreed basic human rights that everyone should have the right to. Article 26 states very clearly, everyone has the right to education. That commitment has then been reiterated and reinforced over time. The World Declaration on Education for All in 1990 stated that every person shall be able to benefit from educational opportunities designed to meet their basic learning needs. It then went on to say that the focus of basic education must therefore be on actual learning acquisition and outcome rather than exclusively upon enrollment. So a key point to note here is that the Education for All Declaration specified this commitment to learning, explicitly pointing out that education includes both schooling and learning. The goal has never been just to get children into school, but rather to ensure that they are in school and learning the skills, capabilities, and competencies that they need for their adult lives. This may seem super obvious and unnecessary to state, but this will be important to keep in mind in the context of some of the data that I'll be showing later on in the later slides. That commitment was then further reinforced in 2000 with the Millennium Development Goals. Goal 2 stated a commitment to achieve universal primary education. However, the target for MDG 2 that was measured was primary school completion. It didn't include a learning measure. And as we know, like so many things, what gets measured gets a lot of the focus and priority. But there was obviously an assumption that attending primary school would provide the foundational skills needed for later learning and life. Then in 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals explicitly included learning in the goal, stating a commitment to ensure that all girls and boys complete free, equitable, and quality primary and secondary education, leading to relevant and effective learning outcomes. The SDG 4 goal then has a whole series of targets that cover both schooling and learning outcomes that are being measured globally right now, currently. Some of the targets for learning include measuring the proportion of children that are reaching what the SDGs term minimum proficiency, so the minimum bar that should be considered proficient for learning outcomes in both reading and mathematics. And the targets specify measuring that in grades 2 or 3, so early in the primary schooling cycle, measuring it at the end of primary school, and at the end of lower secondary school. So as a result, many learning assessments have been both implemented or existing ones have been calibrated to measure progress on SDG 4, and I'll present a few of those today. So what has been the outcome of all of these goals and commitments to education for all children over the past 70 years? Well, the world has been wildly successful at improving access to schooling. Net enrollment in primary school has risen from about 20% in 1950 in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Latin America, and East Asia and the Pacific to nearly 100% in all of those regions today. What took high-income countries more than 100 years to achieve, low and middle-income countries have achieved in about 50 years. This represents one of the greatest achievements in development in the last 70 years. Furthermore, as you can see in the second graph there has also been tremendous growth in access to secondary school. It obviously isn't as high as primary school, but it's on a similar rapid trajectory. So today, nearly all children in all countries attend at least some schooling, and access to secondary school has been growing tremendously. Now, looking at that growth in schooling in just kind of another way with a different angle, we can also see that mean years of schooling in many low and middle income countries increased more than fourfold in the last 50 years. And in some countries, it increased as much as 6 or 7-fold. Looking at this graph, in many countries in 1950, the average years of schooling was only 1 year, meaning that most people were attending no school at all. So there has been just massive improvement in access to schooling in nearly all countries around the world. But where does that leave us? Well, like I said, there was an assumption that schooling would lead to learning. And if schooling and learning were highly correlated, then we could just focus on getting kids into school, measure progress on schooling, and learning would follow. But instead, learning has trailed far behind advancements in schooling attainment, leaving many countries in a learning crisis. As Lamp Pritchett likes to say, today, the place to find children who aren't learning is in school. So what does it mean that there's a learning crisis? Well, I'm going to give a number of examples that illustrate this from multiple different data sets, many different countries, and different perspectives. And I'm going to try to give a perspective of the breadth and the depth of the learning crisis. It's going to be a bit of a crash course, but I've provided links for more reading on nearly every slide. So you're welcome to dig in deeper if you want to. So how do we know that learning is in crisis? One way we know is that assessments, which this graph is showing of young adult women drawing from the demographic and health surveys, show that across more than 50 countries, on average, half of young women with 6 years of schooling cannot read a single simple sentence. What's critical in that sentence is that these are women who sat through school for 6 years, and on average, half of them emerged unable to read. And this was a very simple reading test. Women could choose the language they wanted to be tested in, so it could be whichever language they were most comfortable with, and they were asked to read just a short sentence of 4 or 5 words. You can see some of the examples there. Parents love their children, farming is hard work, the child is reading a book. And yet, many women were unable to do that even after 6 years of schooling. Other data sources show similar findings. AUSTER is a large-scale citizen-led assessment in India, and in a typical year, they assess more than 700,000 children on basic reading and mathematics. And they've been doing these assessments since 2005. You'll learn more about these in a later unit in the course. They found that in 2018, even among grade 5 students, half or more lacked grade 2 level skills. For reading, only about 30% could read at a grade 2 level. Furthermore, as you can see in the graph, there has been a notable decline in learning outcomes since 2008. So things are actually getting worse, not better. Uwezo is a similar citizen-led assessment in East Africa. This is an example of the assessment instrument that you can see here. This one's in English, and the language of the assessment would be adjusted based on context. And you can see how it asks children if they can recognize and name letters, read a single word, read short sentences, and read a short paragraph. Reading and understanding that short paragraph is considered a grade 2 level skill. In Uganda, the percent of children in grades 3 through 7 who can read and comprehend a basic grade 2 story is only 33%. And like in India, this figure has declined in recent years. And again, what's important to note here is that this is among children who are in school, in grades 3 through 7, and they still haven't gained these basic grade 2 level skills. So what this is showing is that the learning crisis is not inherently a schooling crisis. It is inherently a not learning while in school crisis. So to draw attention to the learning crisis, the World Bank developed a learning poverty measure, which measures the percent of 10-year-olds in each country who are either out of school or in school but cannot read and understand a short paragraph. This is calibrated to SDG 4, so the children who are in learning poverty have not met the SDG 4 goal of reaching minimum proficiency in reading. And what the World Bank finds is that in low and middle income countries, 53% of children are in learning poverty. And when you look just at low income countries, 90% of 10-year-olds are in learning poverty. What's interesting is to look at the decomposition, which is what this slide shows. So what you can see is that in Burundi, 94% of 10-year-olds are in learning poverty. But only 3% are in learning poverty because they are out of school. 91% are in learning poverty because they are in school, but have not learned to read a basic short paragraph or a short story. India does better, though still 55% are in learning poverty. But the pattern's the same. Only 2% are in learning poverty because they're out of school. The other 53% are in school but have not yet learned to read. Okay, the last graph for a little bit. This graph draws from PISA for Development Assessments, which adapted the PISA assessment for low and middle income countries. And the PISA assessment is calibrated to measure progress on SDG 4. Getting a score of about 420 or greater means the child has reached minimum proficiency. And this is among 15-year-olds. So this is among older children at a higher bar of reaching that minimum proficiency. And what we can see here is that among the countries that participated in the PISA-D assessments, only 6% on average were reaching the SDG target for minimum proficiency in mathematics. So the depth of the learning crisis is severe. So what does low learning feel like for children who are experiencing it? This video that I'm going to show is based on early grade reading assessment, which measures the words that a child can read per minute. And the video illustrates the struggle to read for children who haven't reached fluency. Now that's rather painful to watch, right? The slowness that those words go by. And that's based on words read per minute among children who can at least read a little bit. And when a child is reading that slowly, they haven't reached the fluency that's necessary, and they're going to struggle with any kind of reading comprehension. Plus, in addition to that, many children are actually at 0 words per minute, and so wouldn't even get that far. Now, what does low learning sound like for children who are experiencing it? These videos come from an early grade reading program in Jordan. And this is what it should sound like for a primary school student to read.
عادت تالا من مدرستها عند الظهر وهي فرحة فسألتها والدتها عن سبب فرحتها فأجابت تالا أثناء عودتي سمعت صوت قط.
And this is what most children actually sound like when trying to read.
عادت
تا شو أول حرف؟ يلا تا تالا من
Okay, now that's rather excruciating to listen to. That child struggles so much. And think how that feels for that child who's trying every day to read at school and in other environments and struggling as much as that child was. Now, a critical point is that while I've focused a lot on foundational skills like basic literacy and numeracy, those are obviously not the end goal of education. They're building blocks for the other skills that we want children to achieve. But if children don't learn those foundational skills, they won't be able to master the later material, which makes it critical to get these basics right. So these findings come from an assessment by Osser of older children, which they call Beyond Basics. And for these, they tested 14 to 18-year-olds on basic, everyday practical tasks. And what they found was, in the first example there, only 39% of youth aged 14 to 18 could calculate the basic time that has gone by in those two pictures. Further, in the second example there, they found that only 50% of youth aged 14 to 18 could correctly figure out how many chlorine tablets would be needed to purify 35 liters of water if they knew how many were needed for 15. These are relatively basic, very practical mathematical tasks that you would use in your everyday life. And because these children have missed out on so many foundations, they struggle with these when they're older. So foundational skills matter because they're the gateway to the other skills that we want children to have. So in conclusion, the data can be cut a lot of different ways, but the conclusion every time is that children are mostly in school. Not all, and every child should have the opportunity to be in school, but most of them are, and they're mostly not learning even basic foundational building blocks to enable later learning. At RISE, we describe this as education systems being coherent for schooling, successfully getting most children into school. Now the challenge is to reorient systems to be coherent for learning, ensuring children learn while they are there. So to close out, this was a high-level overview of the learning crisis. I hope I've convinced you that it is broad and deep and deserves our attention. Next, I'll introduce learning trajectories, which is a tool for understanding the nature of the learning crisis, which can then inform policy priorities for addressing the learning crisis and making systems more coherent for learning. Thank you very much.